Okay, good morning, everybody. And welcome to another CJC webinar. I wanted to just flag that tomorrow at 3 p.m., the CJC will be holding another event with our incoming Siegel Visiting Professor in American Middle East Foreign Policy, Stephen Cook, who will be holding that professorship. He will be speaking in Mortara at 3 p.m. on Iran, the U.S., Israel, Israel, the U.S., and the war in Iran. So please do join if you're able. Today, I'm really delighted to welcome Oren Kessler, and who is speaking to us from Israel today. We'll introduce Oren in a second, but I just want to sort of flag that, of course, there is the possibility that Oren might have to run to shelter, given the ongoing war with Iran and the incoming missiles. So we're keeping that in mind, and of course, wishing not just Oren's safety, but everyone in Israel and friends and family there as well. So we'll be mindful of that. Oren is the incoming Goldman Visiting Israeli Professor with the Department of Government at Georgetown University, and we're delighted to also have him teaching with us at the Center for Jewish Civilization. Oren is also a fellow at the Royal Historical Society. He was previously Deputy Director for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. He's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society in London. Formerly Arab Affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and editor and translator at Haaretz as well. He's raised in New York and Tel Aviv. He holds a BA in history from the University of Toronto and an MA in diplomacy and conflict studies from Reichman University. And Kessler's work has appeared in media outlets from Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Politico, and recently published Palestine 1936, his first book, which was greeted with tremendous acclaim. A Wall Street Journal Book of the Year, winner of the 2024 Sami Rohr Prize for Jewish literature. And as I mentioned, Oren will also be joining us here at Georgetown as the Goldman Visiting Professor with the Department of Government, and of course also teaching with the Center for Jewish Civilization. So we are delighted to welcome him here. Just a quick housekeeping. Oren and I will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. Please use, I think the chat will be disabled, but please use the Q&A function. There should be a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which if it's not if you don't see it there, you can just push the button that says more, and hopefully it will pop up. And you can put your questions there, and we'll do our best to answer all of them in the Q&A section. So please do keep that in mind. Oren, welcome. Such a pleasure to have you and to do this webinar. Hopefully, we won't be interrupted during the hour or so conversation. I wanted to maybe
If we are
start.
interrupted, sorry, if we are
Yes.
interrupted, I'll try to take my computer with me, take
Okay.
you guys to the shelter with me. So I'll try not to leave you hanging.
Okay, I appreciate that, Oren. So wonderful. So, Oren, maybe it would be great if you could introduce yourself to the audience, and maybe the best way to do that is to tell us about your work and tell us about the book in particular, and what motivated you to write it, and maybe more specifically, I think for those who haven't had the chance to read it, and I highly recommend it, is maybe why 1936 is the better reference point for really understanding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict more so than maybe 1948 or other reference points of sort of more obvious in some ways reference points potentially for those who haven't read your book, of course. And then finally, and sorry for the long winded question here, but what, if anything, also surprised you about the reception and the reaction to the book? Oren, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and the students at the CJC and at the SFS and Department of Government. It's a tremendous honor and tremendous opportunity to be joining you all soon in Georgetown in DC. So I just wanted to start by thanking you, and of course thanking also Professor Bruce Hoffman, who's been so integral into making this happen and been so supportive of me and my book and my candidacy. I'm just very appreciative to all of you. So in terms of my book, really, it's again, the book is called Palestine 1936. The subtitle is The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict. And I really felt that this revolt of 1936 to 39, the title is 1936, but of course this is a 3-year revolt. I felt that this revolt was a real lacuna, a real gap in the literature of this conflict. That's not to suggest that nothing had ever been written about this revolt and everything that emanated from it, but I felt that it was really massively under investigated, underwritten about, underappreciated, and that it was and that it was just such a seminal, formative, decisive period for all sides of this conflict. Certainly for the Arabs of Palestine, but equally for the Jews of Mandate Palestine, for the burgeoning conflict itself, for attempts to resolve the conflict. I felt it was really so many facets of the conflict as we know it today took shape in this really forgotten period right on the eve of World War II. There's clear significance of this period in terms of Jewish history and World War II and the Holocaust that was to come. And so in so many ways, and I also once I discovered this time period, I found that it was really just populated by so many complex, compelling characters on all sides, on the Jewish side, on the Arab side, on the British side. This is the triangle in this period, right? Let's not forget it was the British mandate. The British were administering the land, and I really through the book tried to choose a few sort of hand-picked characters or figures on all three sides, and to reveal these the great sweep of history through these individuals. As you mentioned, I worked as a journalist for many years, and I really tried to write in a narrative way, in a sort of human centric way, a individually sort of based way, in order to really bring this story to life, and to try to do that without sacrificing any of the archival or scholarly rigor, and really spending. This book was a product of nearly 5 years of research, full-time research, in 3 languages: English, Hebrew, and Arabic, in archives on 3 continents. So obviously the British archives in London, archives here in Israel. I even used some of the National Archives over in your neck of the woods in DC. And so really, that's what I tried to do. I tried to write something that was very readable, engaging, sort of human-centric, but also, my book has 50 pages of footnotes, and I really tried to in a sense, to offer something. You can never offer something to everyone, but I wanted the real sort of Middle East history nerds to get a lot from this book, but also people who had very little background in this history and this conflict to be able to get a lot from this book as well.
And then of course the final, part of that first question, what did you feel, how
Hmm.
in terms of the reaction to the book, and
Right,
and and
right,
and
right,
what surprised you, if anything?
right. So I was prepared for the worst in a sense, or not for the worst, but I was prepared to get a lot of flack from all sides. I knew that I was stepping into a minefield, namely Israel-Palestine history is some of the most contentious territory out there, and I've been very pleasantly surprised. At the risk of jinxing myself, but I've been very pleasantly surprised by how little the book has drawn. As you mentioned, the book has received a number of Jewish book prizes, but also on the other side of the aisle, if you like, I've had some very pro-Palestinian reviewers review the book and positively. The scholar who reviewed the book for Booklist is very much in the pro-Palestinian camp, and she gave a very generous review, and I'm very grateful for that. For example, so it's really, and in fact, the book has been translated into 5 or 6 languages at this point, and the very first was actually Arabic, which is something I'm very proud of. I donated the rights to an NGO based in New York called Ideas Beyond Borders, and they translated the book into Arabic and made it available free online as an ebook. So it came out in Arabic long before it came out in Hebrew. And it's so there are a few nasty Amazon reviews here or there, but on the whole, it's really been quite encouraging. I mean, it's part of the game of writing a book to receive some negative feedback and some negative criticism. That's part of the deal. But I've been very heartened and encouraged by the fact that on such a contentious issue, um, folks who identify more with this camp or that camp could each find things in the book that they found enlightening, illuminating, that deepened their understanding of the history, and by extension, as a consequence, where we are today. Right? I really wanted this book. Of course, it's a book of history, but it's a book. I really wanted there to be echoes and ripples of the present throughout, and I think a lot of readers have felt that when they're reading through the book and saying, "Wow, this sounds so much like today," even though this is a decade before the state of Israel's birth. So much was different in that period, and yet I think many readers have come away thinking, "Wow, so much really hasn't changed."
No, thank you so much for that. And indeed, I think you really succeeded. The book is incredibly accessible and critical, really, for our understanding, not just of the period, but of the present as well. So really, congratulations on that. I mean, looking though maybe to your courses at Georgetown next year, as a little bit of a preview. I think we have one course that's going to be focused on the subject matter on the 1936 revolt, and we have another on the British Mandate. It may be looking at the second topic. Why do you think it's so important to study the Mandate era? I do want to just flag that I think Georgetown has we're becoming a powerhouse on this particular topic. Together, of course, you mentioned Bruce Hoffman here,
Yeah.
who is, of course, one of the more acclaimed scholars of that period. And now with your addition, this is certainly something that we can acclaim to fame for Georgetown. But why should we maybe focus on the British Mandate? Maybe more to the point, how critical is this period for understanding foundational narratives, I think, of both sides?
Absolutely. Professor Hoffman wrote a seminal book called Anonymous Soldiers. He discussed it just a few days ago on the Chaviv Retigur podcast. If anyone's interested, very interesting discussion, and it's a fascinating account of the mandate, but particularly, and I quote Professor Hoffman's book quite a bit in my own book. It's particularly, I really think it's the authoritative book on the Jewish revolt that followed the Arab revolt. That's the center of my book. I think a lot of people don't necessarily even know that there was a 3-year Arab revolt in the late 1930s in Mandate Palestine, and then from 1944 to 1947 there was a Jewish revolt against the British Empire and against the British Mandate that ultimately sort of kicked the Brits out of Palestine in many ways. Um, and so yeah, the Mandate lives on at Georgetown Georgetown University. So really, I think. I think the mandate. I mean, the the quickest, easiest way to answer your question, I'd say from an Israeli perspective, I tell my Israeli friends that I don't there, in my opinion, there wouldn't be a state of Israel without the British mandate. And here in Israel, there's actually a lot of resentment towards the Brits. I know it's quite popular now on Twitter or on TikTok or whatever, and to suggest that the Zionists and the Brits were co-conspirators in this dastardly plot here in Mandate Palestine. But really, there's a lot when you talk to your average Israeli. There's actually a lot of sort of resentment. There's a feeling that the Brits really betrayed that after the Balfour Declaration and the start of the mandate, that the Brits really started to roll back this whole crazy experiment of Zionism. And then, of course, in 1939, there was the famous or infamous white paper in mid 1939, very critical time for the Jews of Europe, of course, in which the British all but closed the doors of immigration to this land, or they closed it much more tightly than it had been before as a direct result of the Arab Revolt. That's another reason I think this revolt is so important and why it raises so many what if questions. What if they hadn't done that? What would that have meant for the Jews of Europe, for example? But nonetheless, again, I don't think there would be a state of Israel in 1948 without the British mandate. Maybe there would have been one eventually, but the opportunities presented by the British mandate were such. And again, it's of course we'll discuss this at much greater length and depth in my course. But the Balfour Declaration is given of course, on November 2nd, 1917. During World War I, the Allies go on to win the war, of course, and then it's referred to as the British mandate, but it's a League of Nations mandate. This is the League of Nations really giving its imprimatur to this project, to the Balfour Declaration, and saying to Britain, okay, you're going to administer this land on behalf of the League of Nations. And the sort of mandate text enshrines the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So the mandate begins in the 1920s, and really, again, it enshrines that call for a Jewish national home in the land of Palestine and for the facilitation of immigration, Jewish immigration, and quote unquote close settlement on the land. And so the Jews had to rise to this occasion. The British weren't going to do very much of anything on their behalf, but the opportunities presented by the British mandate are what allowed the Jewish community, the Jewish leadership, to really create that springboard from which they announced, they established their state in 1948. The growth of the Jewish national home in those 3 decades of the mandate is just exponentially faster and more dramatic than anything that had come before. And so in the Ottoman period, it was a matter of bribes, and everything was much more difficult. You had a much more hostile government. So that's on the kind of Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, on the Arab side, really, I argue that the mandate period, and particularly the revolt, particularly the Arab Revolt, that's the subject of my book, was really the crucible in which Palestinian Arab identity came together and coalesced. That's not to suggest there was no Palestinian Arab identity before, but it's really in this period of 1936 to 39 that you see virtually all strands of Arab society within Palestine uniting behind a single figure, at least ostensibly, namely the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, but really uniting in a common purpose against a common foe, namely Zionism, the Jewish national movement, and its British imperial facilitators. And so you have rich and poor, urban and rural, Muslim and Christian to a large extent, rival families, including families opposed to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who, at least on the face of it, lined up behind his leadership in this common effort. And so in so many ways, I argue, demographically, economically, territorially, even psychologically, the kind of the seeds of the conflict are sown in this period, and really the seeds of the two nationalisms that really clash for the first time in a really sustained way in the Arab Revolt and arguably, sadly, have been clashing ever since.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely fascinating. And I think it's going to be a tremendous addition, really, to our catalog of courses and the catalog of courses also at the Department of Government. And I think that we're really looking forward to having you on campus for sure. Maybe I could ask you to expand a little bit on that. I mean, one thing that struck me in the book, I think, was sort of the communications between the Palestinian Arab characters that you choose to follow, together with these sort of leading, Zionist Yishuv figures as well. Um, and sort of what that brought about, and if there's any sort of, can we sort of look at them, the development. You talked about this as a sort of pivotal moment in the development of both um, sort of people building, state building kind of projects for both. What can you say more about that in particular, and maybe that struck you during your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned earlier that I really tried to focus on certain characters and to try to tell these wider stories through them. And one of the book's main Arab characters is a man named Musa Alami, who is from one of the great Jerusalem families with a storied history of centuries old history in Jerusalem. And he's a very brilliant man. He's probably the first Palestinian Arab to attend Cambridge. Him and George Antonius are probably the first. Well, George Antonius was from Lebanon, but he spent many, many years in Jerusalem. And a very brilliant man. He was a lawyer. Musa Alami was. He worked in the British Mandate legal system for many years, and he was an Arab nationalist, full stop. But he also had friendships and professional relationships, but indeed friendships across religious and ethnic lines among the British and indeed among the Jews. And one of his really years long uh, friends or companions was none other than David Ben Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency at the time, the sort of Jewish proto government in the sort of pre state period. And so, despite their diametrically opposed political aspirations, Alami and Ben Gurion, they met repeatedly starting in 1934 and then carrying on through 40, 30, 34, 35, 36, 37. And really, it's a relationship that actually lasts into the 70s when Ben Gurion dies in December 1973. Um, and I use this relationship as a kind of one of the through lines of the story, and I think it's a kind of an edifying story that is quite rare in this day and age, certainly when it comes to Israel and Palestine, where you can have these two figures who, despite those diametrically opposed political aspirations, meet in an atmosphere of mutual respect and even warmth. And there's, at the risk of giving away the some of the part of the epilogue of my book, but uh, after the 1967 war, when Israel, of course, conquers the West Bank, the first person who Ben Gurion wants to call is Musa Alami. He says, "Get me Alami on the phone," and they meet in London, and Ben Gurion basically says, now we have a chance finally after all of these decades to really make peace between our two peoples. And I won't tell you why the peace never comes, but it doesn't. That's another spoiler right there. And so it's really in that sense, I think in a certain way, uh, we could learn something from these folks from the 1930s, which is that you can disagree vehemently with every fiber of your body with someone, and yet still sit at the table with them, hash out the disagreements, and really, in their case, really try to find a modus vivendi. They weren't just sitting there yelling at each other or scoring points. They were really trying to figure out: is there a way that your basic needs can be met and my basic needs can be met? And it's possible that the answer was no, but they genuinely tried.
No, thank you for that. Some good color, certainly from the book there. Um, so. trying to sum up at least this first part of the discussion, and looking at the reality that we're in today. Of course, you're a historian, so we'll be kind and won't, give you the sort of crystal ball question, about what's going to happen and how do we resolve this crisis. But after sort of more than 2 years of war and unprecedented violence and destruction. Um, some say that the Middle East has changed irrevocably. Is that the case? Do you see that as the case? And maybe even more so, does this only reinforce the centrality of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, even as we're experiencing a war between Israel, the United States, and Iran, and sort of the focus of your book in some ways, how do you see in this particular context the past informing the present?
So I think the region is transformed in many ways. I think since October 7th, but really since 2024 and Israel's military achievements against Hezbollah and against now the U.S. Israeli strikes on Iran and its proxies. Obviously, Gaza lies in ruins. The vast majority of Gaza, Hamas is trying to rebuild, but it's clearly much weaker than it was before. So I think in many ways the region has, of course, we don't know how the story ends with this current war against Iran. We really don't. As President Trump likes to say, we'll see what happens. So we'll see what happens on that. But I think both in terms of the kind of, and this is getting far beyond my book or anything else, but I think in terms of the Iranian axis is clearly much weaker than it was even a few weeks ago, and I think that can only have massive repercussions for this region. And I think also, there's a lot to be pessimistic about in this region. Certainly, I personally have taken a lot of heart in the Abraham Accords. I never expected to see anything like that in my lifetime. I understand fully and completely that neither the UAE nor Morocco are ideal Jeffersonian democracies, but I really never expected to see a situation in which there were a dozen flights or 2 dozen, I don't even know, from Ben Gurion Airport to Dubai. I think Fly Dubai was the only airline that's been flying here uninterruptedly until now, since October 7th, other than El Al for the most part. So it's really to see this kind of warm peace, I think has been, and I know that there are a lot of people who are not fans of the Trump administration and therefore are quite suspicious of their motives. But I think it's important to also point to a few glimmers of light in a very, very difficult region. In terms of the Israeli-Palestinian file, yeah, it's harder to be optimistic. To be completely honest with you, I see, particularly when I see again so many patterns repeated in 2026 from 1936. I see so many of the same. I see I see many ways in which I fear that the kind of the minimum needs or demands of one side don't meet the minimum demands of the other side. And if you look at the 1930s, it was really, the Jewish leadership, their North Star was eventually at some point to have a Jewish majority in some part of this land and thereby to be able to have a Jewish democratic state. And the kind of the bare minimum for the Arab side, not just the Arab leadership, but the Arab public really was to prevent that at all costs. So it's difficult to split that baby. It's extremely difficult. There's very little when the two sides have so little overlap. It's quite difficult. And I'm not sure. Again, I hate to be the bearer of pessimistic news, but I'm not sure now today in the 2020s how much of that has necessarily changed. I sometimes wonder if there is enough overlap between the two sides to finally bury the hatchet. So I think it's not all doom and gloom in this region. I think there are points of light, there are opportunities. I think, I think I happen to think that a weakening of the Iranian axis would be a good thing for this region. But of course, there are questions about ways and means and day after, which it's probably better I not get into because I'm getting what's the expression, over my skis here. But yeah, yeah.
No, wonderful, Aaron. Thank you so much. Indeed, I think we can say that the past does inform the present in many ways, and it's important to get your perspective on these issues, even if they go a bit beyond your scholarship. But I think it's great, and it's great to hear from you on that. I'm going to open it up to the audience Q&A. We already have several questions, so as I said, I'll do my best to try and get to them and just sort of reading them quickly. I think they run the gamut from very sort of some sort of more technical questions about the history to a little bit of trying to understand how it reflects today's world. But we'll start in order, and I'll just read the first question. In the glossary of names, Charles Tegart, I hope I'm saying that right, and Ord Wingate
Hmm.
are not mentioned.
Hmm.
Yet they are in the index and certainly are key figures. Please explain the contribution of each to the Great Revolt. And then there are a couple of questions subsequent about a recent film called Palestine 36, which I know you've written on, which will give you a chance to talk about, but I'll put those two together. But please, if you wanted to answer about T-Art and Wingate at the
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. So it's actually pronounced Tegart, Jonathan.
Tegart,
So
sorry.
yeah, that's you lose a few points there on the yeah. It's
Okay.
Sir it's Sir Charles Tegart. Yeah, he was a police expert, a policing expert, a counterinsurgency expert, long time servant of the king of the British Empire. He was based in India for a long time in Calcutta, and he was brought over um, when the revolt was raging. He was brought over to Palestine to really advise the government on, to advise the military really and the police on quashing this revolt. And he had some quite heavy-handed, some might even say brutal, but let's methods to really get a handle on this revolt. One was the so-called Tegart Wall, also known as the Northern Fence, which has some, speaking of echoes of the present and in the past, or the past and the present. This was a wall again along the border with Lebanon because the Mufti had fled to Beirut in late 1937 because he became a wanted man by the British. They started to suspect, correctly as it happens, that he was kind of pulling a lot of the strings of the revolt. And so gunmen were coming down from Lebanon into Galilee, into northern Palestine, and committing violence. So they started then this was an example of close British Zionist cooperation, actually, in which the British contracted out the Jewish institutions to build a wall fence along the northern border. They also Tegart created something called Arab investigation centers, which were really interrogation centers across the country. And of course, he bequeathed to us the famous Tegart forts, which still dot this land. There are dozens of Tegart forts all across this land, which are either sort of everything from pillboxes that can hold one or two troops to really hulking police stations, Latrun, the famous station at Latrun, and various other places. Many Israel police stations today are actually housed in Tegart forts. So that's Tegart. Sorry, I'm giving a very long-winded answer. I'll be briefer on Wingate. Wingate
Right.
is a fascinating character, a very controversial character. He was a today we would call him an evangelical Christian, and he was really, due to his very pious beliefs, he was extremely pro-Zionist, and in that he was an army officer who was deployed here, and in being so pro-Zionist, that really set him apart from his most of his comrades, who were the average British soldier or serviceman in Palestine, if we can make such generalizations, was skeptical to hostile to this whole Zionist enterprise. There were definitely exceptions, but that was kind of the norm. And Wingate was very much the exception in that regard. And what Wingate did was he created something called the Special Night Squads, which really, I argue in the book, were kind of the first Zionist special forces and the seed of a future IDF officer corps. And men like Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon served in these night squads that were mixed British Jewish units that operated at night and took the fight to the enemy, namely these Arab armed groups. And so just a massive contribution to the founding of the IDF upper echelon and sort of this IDF special forces. And so again, so why are Tegart and Wingate not in my glossary? It's a very good question. I think I probably wanted to keep a similar number of Arabs, Jews, and Brits. There was probably no wider plan than that, but they're both, especially Wingate, are quite central in my book. And then briefly, that you asked about the film, Jonathan. There was a film that came out recently called Palestine 36. Again, my book is called Palestine 1936. There is no connection between the two. The film is the work of a Palestinian filmmaker by the name of Anne-Marie Jasser. And it has, I wrote about this film last month in January in the Free Press. And it's, anyone watching can absolutely look that up and see my thoughts on the film. I didn't think it was all bad. Maybe the piece gave that impression. There were a few things to like about the film, but I had some real issues with the fact that she kind of airbrushed the Jews out of the story. And it's for me, this goes beyond a question of, is the film pro-Israel, pro-Palestine? I wouldn't expect a Palestinian filmmaker to make anything but a pro-Palestine film. But the airbrushing, the Jews were nearly 1/3 of the population in this period of the Arab Revolt, and really in the film they quite literally speak two words in the entire film. So that and the kind of airbrushing out of the Mufti, I had some real issues with, and I lay them out in the piece.
Wonderful. I think you preempted those two questions. One talked about it, the film actually being screened just yesterday at the American University. And then another one was just asking about a particular scene or character that you thought was historical and entertaining. So if you want to say anything more about it, I'll give you the chance. But I think your answer was pretty complete. But Oren, let us know if you want to continue with this or not.
The character, just if I'm understanding correctly, are we talking about Wingate?
Well, it didn't explain. It just said, please comment on one scene or character from the movie which you felt was historical and entertaining.
Well, there were quite a few scenes that were entertaining. Some of the actors put in really compelling performances. And one thing I actually wrote a few complimentary lines in the film, but the editors took them out. But the one thing I did like was the way she integrated historical footage in a very clever kind of way. They colorized some footage and kind of integrated it in a fairly seamless way into the present, which I thought was quite clever. In the film, there is there is a character called Ord Wingate, but he struck me as kind of a caricature, and he did some things in the film that there's no historical basis for. In the film, he executes a civilian point blank, and I never found any evidence that anything like that ever happened in Palestine. Some of his underlings may have done so. So I don't know. Maybe I'm getting a little pedantic here. I don't think so. But if you're going to call the guy Ord Wingate and you show him doing something so heinous, it has to be backed up historically. That was my issue there.
So in short, read the book. If you see, especially if you see the film, read the book. But read the book regardless. So I think that's that's what we're going to conclude. I'll just move on. And again, please do send your questions. There's a question: what other academic circles and organizations are building on your work?
Oh, that's a very good question. Wow. What are building on my work? I mean, I've
Aside from
been
Georgetown, of course.
hopefully Georgetown University and the CJC. But here and there, I get emails from folks who notice that the book has been included in the college curriculum on a syllabus, which is very encouraging to me. One of the languages that the book has been translated into is German, and we've just gotten word that the German public education system is going to be putting out a special edition of the book at a low price, so that can be part of the curriculum as well. So that's really amazing. So it's really, again, to see my book in German, in Arabic, now in Hebrew. I'm very proud that it's now part of the Israeli discourse as well, because there's also quite a lot in my book that is not necessarily flattering to Israeli or Jewish history. There are a few things there that there are a few characters, more than a few. There are a few quotes that would not be found, shall we say, most likely in a traditional Israeli curriculum. So this stuff is messy. It's very complex. These were very, very fraught times, very precarious times for all sides, and there's a lot. Yeah, it's extraordinarily complex, and I mean, one of the things that I have gotten a sort of little bit of flack for in my book is the amount of space that I devote to the Irgun. I mean, the Irgun was the kind of right wing, much more militant faction of the Jewish national the Zionist movement, and in this period of the Arab Revolt, they began waging acts that can only be described as terrorism. They start to place bombs in Arab vegetable markets because the whole idea was eye for an eye. If these Arab militants put bombs in our vegetable markets, we'll put bombs in theirs. Well, okay, but that's, I mean, if you're seeking to kill civilians, then that's clearly terrorism, right? So for just as an example, so I'm very pleased and very proud that the book is entering the discourse in Arabic as well as Hebrew. Yeah.
Wonderful. No, that's great. And hopefully we have that academic environment that can only nurture these types of discussions here at Georgetown as well. So thanks for that. There's the next couple of questions are more about some of the specific characters. So maybe I'll sort of combine them. There was one question about Hajj Amin al-Husseini's, specifically his activities in exile and post-World War II. I know that's a subject that you're particularly expert in and interested in. And then the sort of follow up to that is who are the Alamis? You mentioned Musa Alami, but also Antoniuses of today. And of course, George Antonius looms very large in the study of the field and of Arab nationalism in general. But maybe you introduced Alami a little bit, but maybe you want to introduce the other characters as well in your answer.
Sure, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, of course, in World War II, he becomes notorious for allying with Hitler, with Nazism. He spends most of the war in Berlin in the service of the Nazis. He meets Hitler once. He meets Himmler at least 3 times. He almost certainly knew about the final solution because Himmler told him so. The Mufti writes quite matter-of-factly in his Arabic memoirs that Himmler told him about the final solution, and he doesn't really, he doesn't seem particularly bothered by it, and he works very hard during the war to make sure that no Jews arrive in Palestine, no children, no anybody, and more importantly, he's the most prominent propagandist for the Nazis in the Arab and Muslim world. He's the chief radio broadcaster in Arabic. He's a recruiter in the Balkans. He recruits 2 divisions of Bosnian Muslims to the Waffen SS. So really, if history had shaken out a little bit differently, he would have been charged for war crimes. He actually escapes detention in France, but that's another story. Well, arguably it's the same story because he comes back he flees France at the end of the war, comes back to Egypt, and kind of basically reclaims the leadership of the Palestinian national movement. And this is certainly this struck the Jews as a tremendous injustice or something unacceptable that this Nazi collaborator would be even allowed at the table. But I think in hindsight, even Palestinian historians, for the most part, agree that this was a massive own goal for the Palestinian movement to bring back this, or to re-embrace this guy who had been an out and out Nazi collaborator, who was damaged goods in at least in the Western world. Um, and so that's Haj Amin al-Husseini, and it's really only after 1948, after the triumph of Jewish Israel and the defeat and dispersal of so much of Arab Palestine, it's really only then that the Mufti is kind of cast into the dustbin of Palestinian national memory, because he really brought them to disaster. And this is, again, there are many accomplished and respected Palestinian and Arab historians who take this view. So that's the Mufti. In terms of the Alamis or the Antoniuses of today, it's a very good question. George Antonius was, as I mentioned, a Lebanese-born intellectual who spent many, many years in Jerusalem. Also part of the Mandate administration at first, and then just sort of a freelance intellectual and writer. And he wrote a book called The Arab Awakening, which was published in 1937-38, right in the midst of the Arab Revolt. And he wrote it, and it was a very, very influential book. This was really the first book in English that presented this concept of Arab nationalism to an English-speaking audience, to Brits and to Americans. And it really was very influential on the British ruling class. I even found a mention in Ben Gurion's diary where he notes that he bought a copy for himself. And so he really had, this is an example of intellectuals really being able to influence the conversation and policy, because he really sways a lot of British minds and a lot of minds in the British policymaking leadership towards really rolling back this Zionist experiment. And then ultimately the white paper of 1939 that I mentioned, that basically says, essentially, our work is done. The Jewish national home has crystallized, it exists, but it won't really be able to grow anymore with it, that they're capping Jewish immigration, and land sales were also severely restricted. And really, this was seen as a tremendous betrayal by the Jews and a real coup by the Arabs, broadly speaking. This was seen as really vindication of the Arab revolt and all the sacrifices that the Arabs had made. But interestingly enough, or perhaps even unsurprisingly enough, the Mufti rejected the white paper for not going far enough. He wanted zero Jews coming in, immediate Arab independence. So he rejected the white paper. But the question was, who are the Alamis and Antoniuses of today? It's a very good question. I think one of the folks who endorsed my book is Mohammed Dajjani here in Jerusalem, who runs a center called Wasatiyya, which means sort of centrism and moderation. I think Professor Dajjani famously was the first Palestinian academic, perhaps one of the first Palestinians, period, I'm not sure, to visit Auschwitz, and he really came under a lot of criticism for that. Ended up losing his post, I believe. But I think Professor Dajjani is very much carrying on the tradition of someone like Musa Alami, and the Antoniuses of today. That's a very good question. Antonius is a very complex character, very, very complex. He actually, yeah, he's that's a tough one. That's a tough one. But he was a great mind, but he was a very troubled individual. And that's a good. I'll have to think about that. Who's the Antonius of today? That's a good one.
Stay tuned for the next event
Yeah,
that we have for you
yeah,
when
exactly.
you're on
Yeah,
campus. We'll
yeah,
open with that.
yeah.
No, thanks. We have about three more questions and about 10 minutes or so. So hopefully we'll get time to get all of them. But we have a question from a PhD student and a Georgetown alum. So here there were previous Arab uprisings in Palestine, most notably the 29 Wailing Wall incident and the 22 uprisings, but they did not coalesce into a major revolt as the 1936 uprising did. Why do you think these earlier uprisings didn't stick, but it did in 1936?
Yeah, it's a great question. There were absolutely outbursts of violence in Mandate Palestine before 1936. There were the first really was in 1920, the so-called Nabi Musa riots in and around the Nabi Musa shrine in the Jericho area, but really in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the center of those riots, and about five Jews were killed. And then the year after that, 1921, here in Jaffa, there were bloodier riots in which about roughly 50 Jews were killed by Arabs and roughly 50 Arabs by British police. And it was really, and then 1929, as the questioner mentions, 1929, famously or infamously, the Hebron riots of 1929, which were very grim, gruesome, horrific acts of terrorism that really recall the worst of the October 7th attacks in their cruelty. There was rape, there was mutilation. It was really horrific in Hebron, which is today in the West Bank, and in Safed, Tzfat, in the north, and a few other places, in which 133 Jews were killed in total over several days. And sort of in the book, I would never for a moment dismiss or downplay the significance of these outbursts of violence, but I present them as just that: riots, disturbances, terrorism, but not a sustained nationalist uprising, not an intifada in the parlance of our day. The first time we see anything on that scale is, in my view, the 3-year Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39. None of even 1929, with all its grimness and gruesomeness, and was only quote unquote 2 days of violence in Hebron, and then roughly a week of violence across the entire country before it was finally quelled. Whereas this revolt, the Arab Revolt, was again a sustained 3-year uprising that actually began with a 6-month general strike, which even to this day is one of the longest general strikes anywhere in the world. And so there were economic demand, there were national political demands behind. Yes, the revolt began in kind of spontaneous violence, but it was very quickly matched by the Arab leadership, above all by the Mufti, with political national demands and economic actions that in some ways almost recall the boycott Israel movement in a sense, but really the idea was the Arab community was going to have no economic ties with the Jewish economy or indeed with the British authorities until certain demands were met, demands over immigration and land sales and representation. And so why did they not stick? I think, and I'll try to be brief, but I think the background to all of these questions, or to so many of them, is demographic. And really, by the 1930s, of course, Hitler comes to power in January 1933. Other anti-Semitic movements are on the rise in Europe, in Hungary and Romania and Poland, and this has the effect of just turbocharging Jewish immigration to mandate Palestine. There was also quite a friendly, from a Zionist perspective, high commissioner in Palestine at the time by the name of Arthur Walkup. And so, really, in the first half of the 1930s, the Jewish population here doubles. In Mandate Palestine. Here, more specifically in Tel Aviv, the population triples in that period. Land sales double. And so really, the sort of Arab community is certainly perceptive enough, even subsistence farmers in the countryside who may not, there was still widespread illiteracy in this region at that time, but they were certainly perceptive enough to recognize that the face of this country was changing demographically, and that if things continued in this direction, the Jews would be a majority before long. So I think that's why the 1930s, the mid-30s, were such a breaking point. Yeah.
Thank you. So moving on, which books, aside from your own, would you recommend in a college survey course on Jewish history that can communicate the complexity of British, Arab, and Jewish relationships in the pre-state era in broad yet interesting strokes? And I should say this comes from one of our faculty members, so it's a
Oh,
bit of a
right.
self-serving question. So this is important. This is an important one. So please go ahead.
Well, I've already mentioned Professor Hoffman's Anonymous Soldiers. It's really fantastic. Yeah, I'm rereading it at the moment, and it's really very, very unique and highly recommended. I've also very often recommended Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete. I think he's a very talented storyteller, and he's a journalist himself, and he just he really he's very very good at bringing out the sort of human dimension and the human stories behind these historical events. So I think One Palestine Complete is really really excellent. There's let's see, I've just I've just started reading A Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin. That's a bit earlier, and that's not strictly Palestine related, but so far I'm finding it very, very illuminating. There's one other book that is kind of forgotten, but I think ought to be rescued from semi-obscurity. It's by Arthur Koestler, the author of Darkness at Noon, who of course was a famous novelist, of course, but he wrote a history of the mandate called Promise and Fulfillment, and he kind of wrote it in real time because he spent quite a bit of time here during the mandate. He lived here in the 20s, and then in the 40s he was here quite a bit, and he just has such a perceptive eye that I think I may, and he's just such a fantastic writer that I think I'll probably assign excerpts from Kustler's book as well, Promise and Fulfillment. It's really very very incisive. Yeah.
Great. And then finally, we have another question. Fantastic book. Good to hear that there will be an education version of the book in Germany, as this will boost the readings. I appreciated the historicization of the conflict through the lens of the revolt. I'm wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on potentials and limits of such an historicizing approach.
Okay. It's a very good question. I wonder what I'm not sure I understand the question fully. What do we mean by
Well,
historicizing?
maybe that it's just, is this a comprehensive way, perhaps if I'll editorialize a little bit, but a comprehensive way of truly understanding the conflict? Does this help us understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or does a historian's approach have limitations, and what those
Huh,
might be?
huh. Well, I think, look, I wouldn't want to suggest, there's always an impulse for an author to suggest that, nothing before his or her book has any importance. And it's right. It's like, in Arabic, you say the jahiliya, right? Is the period of ignorance that came before revelation, right? And I wouldn't for a moment want to say that nothing before 1936 is of any importance. Of course, that's not the case. You have to, the Balfour Declaration, of course, is a touchstone of this history. There were things before the Balfour Declaration. Zionism didn't emerge one day in 1917, but that's clearly a touchstone. The start of the mandate is clearly a touchstone. 1929 is very important in itself, the riots that we discussed. But I think and so I wouldn't want to suggest that anyone could only read my book or take my course on the revolt or even on the mandate and understand everything. But I do think that sometimes it can be useful and revelatory to take a certain to take something as a microcosm of something bigger. And I think the revolt kind of it serves that purpose. It kind of contains the mandate or the primary dynamics of the mandate in miniature. And and again, I hope this is answering the question, but I think um understanding the revolt and or the mandate doesn't cover all of the bases, but I think it covers quite a lot of them, and really gives a feeling and a glimpse into the broader dynamics that were happening here in this period.
Excellent, Oren. Thank you so much. Thank you for these for answering these questions and for engaging with our audience, with our students and our faculty here at this webinar. I think it's pretty clear that you are going to be a tremendous addition to the academics and the conversation here at Georgetown next year, and we're extremely lucky to have you. So we look forward to having you on campus next year. And of course, before I let you go, just really wishing you all the best, and you and your family be safe, as safe as possible, of course, at this difficult period in the middle of war. And thank you really for the fascinating talk.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really really appreciate it, and really appreciate everyone for tuning in, and I really can't wait to meet all of you in person fairly soon.
Wonderful. And Oren, and just to remind everybody, we this has been recorded. We're putting it on our YouTube channel. Please do look at our social media and our YouTube channel for some of the other talks that we've had over the past year. Oren, all the best. Thank you.